I'm Chris. Actually, going full circle, my first documentation work was actually on the Drupal project years ago. If you ever read the Drupal 7 installation guide, I did a lot of work on that. So we've come full circle. I can also see one person in the room who knows way more stuff about what I'm about to talk about than me. So that's intimidating. And I've actually learned a lot of this from Paul. So a lot of this is borrowed from him. And I guess the thing to say is this is based on my research, and there's always going to be more. There's always going to be things missing, and et cetera, et cetera. All right, I will now switch to sharing screens. All right. So as you can see in my presentation, I have 2 slides, which doesn't make for a very interesting talk. So that was purely just to start with something. I'm actually just going to jump straight into a text editor. I've done this before, and it sort of worked reasonably well. We'll see how we go this time. So it's actually a post I wrote for one of the sites I write for called dzone, and I'm just going to use it as a reminder to myself of what to refer to, but also just to show you things in operation. So I guess the first question is, what exactly is linting? Okay. Well, linting, if you've done much code, you might know that linting is a way of sort of giving you recommendations of how to improve your code. It's not forcing you to do anything unless you want to. You can make it so that code doesn't make it live unless the linting is 100% or 90% or whatever. Or you don't have to do that. It's kind of up to you. But what a lot of people don't know is there's actually similar principles for text, mostly English language, I'm afraid. There's a couple that support other languages that I know of, but there's probably others as well. And I guess you could think of it a little bit like the sort of grammar checker that you may have used in Word and other tools like that. But because of the nature of it, because it's sort of made for a technical tool chain, you can hook it up to code editors, as you can see in this window here. You can hook it up to build systems. You can use it in a terminal window. You can build all sorts of tooling around it. And that's kind of the fun thing, actually. And of course, if you're doing technical documentation, it means you can mix code linting and language linting together. And I'm going to show you a selection of some of the ones I know about and mention some of my favorites as we go through that. I'm going to mostly use the Atom text editor to demonstrate some of them. Firstly, because yes, it's what I use. But secondly, just because it actually has quite probably the best support for linters out there. As you might see, there's actually a few that only work in Atom. So, okay, let's start. So the first one I'm going to cover is Alex. It's, as you can see from their website, some websites for these projects vary. It's for catching insensitive and inconsiderate writing. And this I find especially useful, especially in technical documentation where we want to be as considerate as possible to a broad community. Sometimes we can have the tendency to say things without really, or write things without really thinking. And it helps us identify some of those. And we can see some examples here. And there's some interesting examples in this screenshot here. Obviously, there's one of those words in red that is definitely usually not okay. But then there's things that we don't always think about, like slave and master. They're common words that we use in technical speak, but they're actually falling out of favor quite quickly. I know a lot of projects that are changing the way they word slave and master in sort of multiple instance systems. And so it helps us with things like that. And we could see, I was going to get this in the right order. So we could see here, this is the article I wrote in Atom. And actually you can see what I was experimenting with here. And the linter of Atom, this is a linter panel at the bottom, just showing me a selection of the linters I have enabled and what it suggests. You can see some of the suggestions. So he may be insensitive. Fortunately, in English, that's reasonably easy to change in theory, depending on what you're trying to say. And it's mentioning the master-slave thing. We also have got hook down here. Sometimes it can be overly sensitive, but that's sort of a personal thing, I suppose. And I've never quite understood why American is profane. But anyway, I'm not entirely sure. British isn't for some strange reason. I don't know. But whatever. That's a whole other conversation. So that's what Alex is good for. It's quite popular, actually. And as you can see, we have support in as an NPM module, so you can use that in a build system or on a command line, Atom, Sublime, Visual Studio Code, and also things like Slack even. You can even have it watch Slack messages. But because it's a JavaScript package, I mean, you can hook it up to all sorts of things. And some people have actually made browser extensions for Alex and things like that too. So it's actually quite flexible in that way. And it's quite popular. Okay, that's actually not the one I wanted next. This was the one I wanted next. Just Say No. It doesn't really have a web page, just a GitHub project. And this helps you identify things called hedge words. And this is another interesting one that fits quite nicely with Alex in that it helps you identify what it calls sort of lack of confident writing and trying to be factual instead of opinions. And I mean, when or not this may be appropriate can depend on what you're writing. Sometimes I'm writing a blog post where I can be more opinionated. Sometimes in documentation, we don't want to be so opinionated. Or when we have an opinion, it's a confident opinion. To install, you do this, not maybe you should do this, things like that. And it tries to help highlight some of those sorts of hedge words. Actually, I have to remember if I actually have this installed. I don't think I actually have it set up on my, because I have it. Some of these linters get packaged up with other things as well. And here's an example here. So you're getting a hint of what's to come. But so something like seems is a very good hedge word. React seems like a good fit for your project. Especially even in blogs, maybe we just want to say it is a good fit for your project if so and so and so, and be more confident about our statement. That's sort of what it's aiming to do. I'm also wondering, no, that's just one. Yeah. So it's a little, it's sort of slightly, sometimes hard to fix issues. It might highlight things like may, for example, some. There's occasions, especially in English, when those words are hard to replace. And this is one of the nice things I find about linters. Actually, they can occasionally be bothersome and annoy you, but actually they start to make you think more about your writing and improve your writing over time, which is the point of a linter anyway. It's actually only available in Atom. I did do some digging around in the repository to see if it was using an external resource, but it isn't. I'm sure it can be, if someone wants to rewrite it for another tool, I'm sure it can be, but at the moment it is just mostly in Atom. Okay, right, good. This is actually one of my favorite linters, one I use quite a lot. I like it because write good is not good writing. It got a sense of humor. As you can see from the description as well, linter for English prose for developers who can't write good and want to learn to do other stuff good too. That's it's got a sense of humor, this linter, which is quite nice. What it actually highlights varies somewhat. I'm going to show you some examples here. So you actually has a variety of different things it checks for that you can enable and disable. Here is an example here. Just. So this are words like just, simply, easy, words that, I mean, maybe something is easy, but if you say it's easy and then someone finds it not easy, that can be sort of misunderstood, or it could be even be deemed offensive, things like that. Don't assume that anything is easy or simple. So it helps you highlight words like that. And also words like weasel words here. It's really easy, really doesn't really add anything in that context. So you could just say it's easy. That's perfectly fine. And that's some of the things it tends to highlight. I'm going to show you a couple of other, where is it down here? It lists a lot of the checks you can look for here, things like weasel words, things like checking for so at the beginning of a sentence, passive voice, which is a whole big conversation, and a whole set of other tests you can enable and disable. And you could do that if you're using it on a command line, or you can use it. You can do that if you're using it in some of the text editors. And you can actually see this is one of the cases where there is another language, Schreib gut, which anyone who knows any basic German will know. That's the German version. And here's some of the checks here down here. Again, it's available as an NPM module in Atom, in Drafts, which is not an open source text editor. It's a Mac only text editor, but they use it under the hood. Visual Studio Code, Sublime. And again, as it's JavaScript, you could repurpose it into multiple other use cases if you wanted to. Okay, well, let's look at Prose Lint. I'll go back to my description here. I still find it slightly hard to know exactly what they're doing with this linter. It says that it combines learning from a collection of great writers. And you can actually look at the list of their great writers, and whether you agree or not that they're great writers is somewhat up to you, to help write better prose. I mean, I guess as it's a linter, linters by design are to give you advice. So in some respects, there's no harm turning these things on. And if you don't agree with the advice, you don't have to follow it. And especially in the case of ProseLint, sometimes you're not entirely sure where it gets its advice from. So it's a little unclear. But here's some examples of some of the things it looks for. So in this very contrived sentence, I have in the center, spelt English way, of the center, spelt the American way, sat a bunch of cats. What were they doing? So this highlights my, firstly, my spell checker is unfortunately saying that my English spelling is wrong, but ProseLint will also in this case highlight the fact that I've used inconsistent spelling of center, and it also will highlight bunch of cats and give me the correct words, glaring, that's it. So it does this sort of weird collection of checks, and I'll go back to the web page to. There's a lot of text before you actually get to what it tells you. So there's a whole bunch of weird things here. Some jargon, archaic forms, cliches twice, which is strange. Consistent spelling, which is the one I just talked about. Corporate speak, cursing, using the correct formats for dates and times, hedging words, which we already covered, jargon, offensive terms. So you can see it mixes up a lot of the some of the linters we've already looked at. And again, you can enable or disable these checks. And it's quite a few, but it's quite broad, as you can see. In fact, I'm only halfway down the list. It's quite broad. It's not one I use on a regular basis. I'm actually thinking I will enable it again. And as you'll see with some of these, there's actually a lot of overlap between these linters anyway. But this has quite a lot of availability, actually. It's one of the interesting things. It's actually a Python module originally. This is quite interesting because a lot of JavaScript projects use it, and they bootstrap the Python module, which means you have to sometimes have Python as a JavaScript dependency, which is interesting. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation. You can also use it online if you want to. It has support in Sublime, in Atom, in Emacs, in Vim, in Fabricator, which is a build system, in Danger, which is another sort of build system, which I'd never even heard of before, Visual Studio Code, Koala, which we'll come to in a minute, and IntelliJ. So it actually has quite a lot of support. And so for one of those sort of general purpose linters, which we're sort of transitioning into in this presentation, that you don't want to do much work setting up, it could be a nice start point. And on that note, we're now going to move into a slightly different area of linters. So far, we've mostly looked at kind of single task linters or a subset of single tasks. And now we're going to look at a couple of options that actually let you not only combine other linters, but also let you define some of your own. So that kind of golden, that sort of magic bullet that a lot of people are looking for, of not only linting for common standards, but also your own corporate standard, maybe. The way that you spell certain words, the way that you want to say certain things, for example. So a lot of these ones coming up will let you do that as well. I'll just quickly switch to the Veil website. It's quite, as you would expect from something like this, it's a little bit more complex to get started. And you can already see from this screenshot here that it brings in some of the checks from other places, things like passive voice and hedging and wordiness. But it also lets you add some of your own custom styles too. And actually, you'll see, where is it? Somewhere. Oh, here we go. Somewhere you can actually see the styles that certain open source projects have contributed as well and see how they did it. So, of course, the problem with something like this is it's hard to demonstrate because it's so configurable. What will it highlight? What it highlights is somewhat up to you. But I've done a very broad example, and this is already duplicating some of what I have down here. Where's Veil? So this is my Veil section of my linter here. So it's highlighting some words we've already seen in other linters, things like hedging and weasel words. So, for example, if we go to that, we will actually see an atom, right, good, and Veil are both showing that. Giving slightly different justifications, but it's sort of similar. It also adds in another one here. I can't quite remember what this check is called, but instead of saying not old enough, try saying too young. So being positive instead of negative. That's one of the extra checks that comes with Veil by default. And then a passive voice example again. So yeah, it's slightly hard to completely go into what you can do with Veil. And because a lot of it revolves around config files like this. I don't know how readable this is. But here I have defined where I have stored external custom styles. And in this case, I'm actually loading the right good and the pros linters into Veil. How I want the alerts to be shown, suggestions, warning, errors, what sorts of files I want to check, and then the sorts of styles I want to enable, and et cetera, and et cetera. There's a whole bunch of settings we can set. And the interesting thing with something like Veil is you can actually set these files globally or at a project level. So if you're working for different clients or on different projects, you can actually turn on and off checks at a project level as well. So these require a lot more setup, but once you've got it working, it's something you can share around, it's something you can build on, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it has reasonably good support. There's a native package. I'm not actually 100% sure what Veil is written in, but say, for example, on a Mac, you install it with Homebrew, so it's not an NPM package. You can use it in Atom, you can use it in Emacs, you can use it in Sublime, Visual Studio Code, and Vim. So all the kind of major text editors, really. And then in a very similar vein is TextLint. I actually made a quick note here that I'm going to try and refer to. So TextLint tends to have more built in by default, whereas Veil, you tend to have to sort of start more from scratch and then configure what you want. But they work in fairly similar ways. I've also found that TextLint tends to give you better hints instead of just saying this is wrong, saying like why it's wrong and things like that. But again, I mean, these are all extendable. So a lot of these, if you don't like something, you can configure it. So we'll switch to the website. Yeah, again, it's fairly simple. They have a live demo you can play with here. There's different tests you can enable and disable. So again, demoing exactly what it does is hard because it depends what you've configured. In this little case, I have done weasel words, and I have also enabled, I haven't obviously got it turned on right now, but for this demonstration, I had TBD as an unexpanded anacronym. And again, in certain contexts, you might be fine with that. In other contexts, you might want it to say to be defined instead. And as with Veil, you have these TextLint RC config files that you can enable and disable the settings you want at a global level or a project level. So again, giving a lot of flexibility. Just to give you a quick idea of what's available for TextLint, it's quite a lot. I must admit, I want to go and correct this page here because having a linter with a bit of a grammatical problem in the opening is something I really want to go and correct, which I will. But as you can see, I'm going down this list. It's quite a lot of rules, and you also saw a few different languages there too. So TextLint has a lot of options, including a lot of the ones we already looked at. So where is it? Write good is in there. No, prose isn't in there. There's quite a few in there, and a lot of things I have not really used that much either. Things like bringing in rules from Wikipedia's list of common misspellings, incorrect apostrophes, buzzwords, correct capitalization. There's a lot, but I have found that always found it a bit fiddly to get working in the first place. It's a bit fussier than Veil, but once you get it working, you can see you have a really rich world of rules to draw from. And again, it has a reasonably good ecosystem of ways to use it. An NPM module, NetBeans, strangely. Only time I've ever seen NetBeans with a linter for text in. Atom, Sublime, Visual Studio Code, Vim. I don't think I came across an Emacs one. And Koala, again, is something similar. This is actually a local-ish project. This was kickstarted by someone in Hamburg, so close-ish to both of us, but with sort of people working on it all over. I'm not going to give a demo of this because, I mean, Koala is interesting because it does some of what we already looked at with Veil and TextLint, but it's actually more broad. Koala is designed to be a linter for everything. So it has linters you can enable for text, but it also has linters for JavaScript and PHP and et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of a general purpose linter for your whole project, not just your documentation. And again, it requires a little bit more configuration. The project is a little newer, so you will undoubtedly hit some bugs with it as well. But the maintainer is very friendly and always willing to help you and is in our time zone. So that's a bonus, so an unexpected bonus. And yes, its sort of plugins are called Bears, which is very nice. Although I'm half Australian and I can't get over the incorrect spelling of koala there, but that would be too confusing if it wasn't, maybe. So yeah, it's a much broader project. But again, it has quite good support, as you can see. It is a Python project originally. They also have a Docker image. You could make it run in Git hooks. And they've actually built, like, they're building their own sort of SaaS product around the Git hook Git hook hooks. I'm trying to call it. Atom, Sublime, brackets. Only time I've ever seen something available with brackets as well. Eclipse, Vim, Visual Studio, and Emacs. So quite a lot of options again. Now, just a very quick round off. So the ones we've looked at are probably the most common, probably the most useful. But there's a couple of others available that I just want to go into. Anorak, this is a very, very specific one that you might find useful. A specialized spell checker, not quite a linter, but kind of, that finds incorrect indefinite articles, a instead of an, for example. Could be useful. It's a strange, actually, because very few of the other linters even include this, and this is quite a common mistake to make. So it's interesting that it's not so commonly used. I include aspell here. So aspell and hunspell are actually spell checkers that a lot of projects use. So they're not, spell checking isn't really linting, but it kind of is. And as you probably saw in my linter here, I actually, somewhere, there we go, I use aspell with a a spelling linter in Atom, so I get everything in one place as well. So spelling is kind of a linter, and this is just to mention that. And there's a lot of wrappers for Hunspell and Aspell. Another very, very specific one, only available in Atom, corrects America. It corrects us Europeans' inappropriate use of British English. So very, very specific. But anyway, I think that's covered really in other packages. It's sort of more for a joke, I think, than anything else. This is actually one made by the Write the Docs community. This is a linter that lets you check your docs against the IBM Style Guide. I would actually probably get back in touch with this person and suggest they maybe sort of refitted it into Veil or Textlant instead. So it has a broader use, but it gives you an idea of what people are putting out there. And then finally, I'm actually going to wrap up with a few other things that are not quite linters, but are useful all the same. And most of these are not open source. Most of them are commercial, but still, if me showing you a bunch of linters in a text editor was a little off-putting and scared you away a bit, I'm going to show you a couple of other tools that are much simpler to use. But bear in mind, yeah, they are often commercial. That's not a bad thing per se. And also the interesting thing about linters is they tend to not look at the context of the word very much. They just look at what the word is and tell you if it may be a problem or not. Whereas some of these other options tend to analyze more the makeup of the sentence. So Hemingway is one that's especially good for blog posts, maybe not so useful for technical writing, but because it's mostly aimed at, kind of what Hemingway was famous for, short sentences, uncomplicated words, etc., etc. And you can see some of the sorts of tests it's running on the right-hand side. I use this every now and then. I used to use it way more. I use it less now because I tend to find it complains way too much about having long sentences when actually I want that sentence to be long and things like that. So, it's sometimes useful, sometimes not. Another one which is quite well known is Grammarly. Strangely, Grammarly is actually made in Ukraine, despite being an English language hacker. I was initially skeptical with Grammarly, but actually I am now using it almost every day. Actually, no, I use it every day now. I even paid for it. I find it actually very useful. I will use linters to check the individual words, and then I find Grammarly very good for the kind of context of words. But it is paid. It is an open source, so that may or may not put you off, but I have actually personally found it quite useful. And a couple of others are things like Nitpicker, which is similar to some of these, not massively used, but another option. A sort of older project is Language Tool. And actually one thing I will mention on all of these in this little section is they're not really designed for technical language. Hemingway recognizes things like Markdown code fences and won't spell check code. Grammarly doesn't. Language Tool doesn't. So if you're doing technical documentation with a lot of code and a lot of jargon and a lot of specific things for technical documentation, some of these tools will not recognize those and will endlessly bug you about JSON being incorrectly spelt and things like that. So, just be wary of that. They're not designed for technical writing. But Language Tool is used. You can use it in OpenOffice. You can use it in Word. I think it's a Java project. And as you can see, it's also got other language support. So it may be useful to you. I don't use it, but it may be useful to you. Just if you're looking for something a little less complicated to get started up with. And then finally, this is kind of going completely, if you thought Grammarly was maybe me suggesting something, a paid for service like Grammarly was the extreme, someone like Acrolinx are the complete extreme. They're actually based here in Berlin, I think, strangely. And they're a completely enterprise level kind of project. But again, if that's the world you're in, and if it fits into your tool chain, it may be useful. I've never used it because it's an enterprise project, and to even get a demo, you have to register a sales call and all that kind of stuff. So that puts me off immediately. But it's an option. It's quite popular. in certain communities, so I didn't want to not mention it, but it's very much designed for a sort of certain type of user. And with that, I will return to my second slide, which is just a thank you. And this is me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.